Thank you, everyone, for showing up in person for this conversation with father and author James Robinson, author of the memoir More Than We Expected. I was introduced to James in the spring by a palliative care doctor that James and I can't even remember how it happened, but not anybody that either of us really knew, but they knew enough after they talked to James to say, you need to go talk to Courageous Parents Network. And James and I connected and liked him. We connected immediately for obvious reasons, as you will see. James sent me a galley copy of his book in PDF form, which I read and absolutely loved. I have a real appreciation for memoirs that connect us as human beings to each other and to the bigger pieces of what it means to be human. It happens that More Than We Expected is a book about parenting a child born with a congenital heart defect and therefore a life threatening and ultimately life taking illness. But that is not why I love this book. I love this book, and this is why I recommend it. And this is why I hope many, many people who don't have a personal experience will read this book. I love this book because of how James writes about what it means to cope with and find your way through the mystery of illness, the mystery of life and death, the the quandary of making decisions in the face of uncertainty, the kindness of people you meet along the way, surrendering to the mystery, and finding deep meaning. And I think I will read any book that is about that. And that is what this book ultimately is. And over the course of this conversation, we're going to walk through some of my favorite parts and hear from James about how this all came to be. So without further ado, I welcome James Robinson and ask you, James, to please introduce yourself and in the context of your family, and then to the extent that you can, a little summary of More Than We Expected.
Thanks, Blythe. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I've appreciated our conversations, and I'm glad we had the chance to talk to the Courageous Parents Network, which is a really great organization, and glad to connect with other parents and medical professionals in similar situations, which is part of the reason I wrote this book. It's about our son, Nadav. My wife, Talia, and I have three sons, one who's now 16, one who's 12, and the 12-year-old has a twin who was born 12 years ago with a very serious congenital heart defect. Single ventricle, which came as a result of heterotaxy, which your medical listeners will probably know what that is, but I can explain in more detail if there's interest. Basically, what it meant, though, was that he would need three surgeries before the age of 4. And the hope was that those three surgeries, if successful, would bring him to teenage years, where he would be a candidate, hopefully, for a heart transplant. Luckily, there are not too many infant hearts available, so you really have to wait till you're fully grown to be a candidate for transplant. But we knew that we had no illusions about the road ahead, that it would be a difficult road. The first surgery was at 5 days, the second was at 5 months, so it was kind of an immediate thing as well. And I knew that there was a chance that at some point I would have to tell his brothers that he had died, and that was the thing that terrified me most of all. He emerged from those 3 surgeries pretty much unscathed. There were some weird moments in a couple of them, which you can read about in the book. But soon after his third surgery, we had the opportunity to go to a country that I loved and my wife loved, Australia. And my mother is from there. And we had the opportunity to go. And one thing that we always resolved to do when the boys were born, all of them, healthy or not, was to give them the best life that we could. For us, that meant traveling. I mean, we love to travel and experience amazing things, and we want to have them to have the opportunity as well. So we took them to Australia, which was magnificent. It was a great time until 2 weeks after we arrived, when Nadav was diagnosed. Did not look well. Took him to the hospital, where he was diagnosed with a clot in his circulation. and it needed emergency surgery. So suddenly we found ourselves stranded on the other side of the world, doctors that we weren't familiar with. We'd built wonderful relationships with our doctors back home. Suddenly we were in a place where we knew nobody, facing an emergency surgery that, as it ended up, lasted 14 hours, 7.5 hours on bypass. And he emerged the sickest kid in a ward reserved for Sydney's um, sickest cases. And it was a difficult situation, because suddenly we were staring face to face with the reality that he might not make it in a place that we hardly knew. Um, I'll go very briefly over the rest of the book because I know there's questions that you want to ask. Um, the book tells the story of how we got home, and we did get home. We met remarkable doctors in Sydney. They treated us with respect and kindness that we had never experienced before, really, or we had no reason to expect, given that we were strangers in their land, at least. Sorry, that was not intimate that we didn't have experience that kindness from most other doctors, but we saw the world differently through their eyes. Um, and in fact, thanks to a bunch of occurrences, we managed to arrange a flight home when we had been told point blank that he wouldn't make it. And long story short, a team of medical professionals from the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia flew on a Gulfstream 3, which you can see on the front of this book, to Australia, um, to try to bring Nadav home. And it was pretty incredible. They landed, they were like astronauts. They had blue jumpsuits that said CHOP transport on the back and American flags. And they brought him home miraculously, or at least brought him to Philadelphia, on a tiny plane that made 3 stops halfway around the world. And in Philadelphia, he underwent an experimental surgery, not experimental, a new surgery, sorry, a new procedure pioneered by Dr. Jack Rome at CHOP. And we spent 6 months in Philadelphia, suddenly able to hope for recovery instead of just stability. And spending 6 months in a hospital is not easy, and I'm sure we're going to talk about that as well. His brothers by that point had returned home to New York. Tali and I went back and forth, trading places. And then 6 months later, after a bunch of frustrating setbacks, he found his way home for real. Taught himself to walk again. He learned how to talk again while in hospital, and returned home just in time to be enrolled in kindergarten in our home in New York. Even though by that point it was clear that he was uh, unfortunately not a candidate for transplant. We had hoped that he would be, and we never gave up, but we knew that, again, there was a possibility that he did not have long to live. And that January, after an amazing few months in kindergarten, at home with his brothers, he passed away. And I was suddenly faced with the reality that I'd always feared, which was having to tell his brothers that he had died. And the book, in many ways, is the story of how I found the strength to do that, not just be a parent in a difficult situation, but cope with probably the most difficult situation of all, which is saying goodbye to your son. Um, and I'm happy to talk about
Yeah.
it all. Yeah.
So they're pieces, they're different. If I were teaching this book, there are different threads that you could teach all the way through, right? There's the medical thread, there's the existential thread, there's the spiritual thread, um, there's the parenting thread. Just for a moment, James, if I were a parent whose child was living in the ICU, whether it was the cardiac ICU, the PICU, the NICU, it wouldn't matter. I would find this book to be a companion and a comfort because you really describe, and I don't have this experience, but I've talked to enough parents for whom this was their life, like living in the NICU or the PICU, or the cardiac ICU for months. You capture what it's like when the hospital becomes your home and the clinicians become your family of sorts. Will you talk a little more about that? I mean, there was the Australia chapter where he lived for a long time. There was the CHOP chapter. You had different medical families.
It's funny you mentioned family. They do feel like family to us. I mean, he spent significant time in 4 hospitals, and 3 of those we spent really significant time there. Mount Sinai was his home hospital in New York, and we developed very, very strong relationships with the doctors there. Although he was, aside from recovering procedures, was never really an inpatient there. I guess in the PICU after his birth. Um, at the NICU than he was. In Australia, we suddenly were surrounded by strangers, people we didn't know, who had a very different way of practicing medicine. Um, but we managed, my wife Talia and I managed to form really strong bonds with him as well. That was based on mutual respect, I think. Once we sort of figured out what made them tick, I think we were able to form those bonds. And then in Philadelphia, where we were inpatient for 6 months, that really became our home. I mean, in Australia, it was literally Tali's home. She stayed in a hostel in the hospital. In Philadelphia, we lived nearby. But that was 6 months that we saw changing of the seasons there. And at that point, it becomes more than just medical treatment. If it's your home, then suddenly you have to learn how to live in a hospital. And that was something that was very important to us, is making sure that he was not just a patient. So early on in our odyssey, I think in New York, one of the doctors at Mount Sinai said, never forget that he is our patient, but he is your son. And we really took that to heart. We really saw the whole person. We hope the doctors did too, but we found that we were advocates for him, not just in terms of medical areas, which we felt we had a certain amount of expertise, but in terms of, what a little kid should have as his life, even if he happened to be stuck in a hospital. And in a lot of ways, we really pushed the boundaries, maybe a lot further than they would have liked. But we were pretty insistent that he was able to live and not just recuperate, as it were.
Can you give one of the examples that's a little more insistent than the,
Well, I'll tell you what happened in Australia, which was really remarkable. Um, One thing was not remarkable is being told that your son won't make it. And we were told at least twice in Australia that he would not make it. And after the first time we were told that, the doctor in charge of the unit, a man named Nick Piggott, um, said the next morning, we're going to try to take Nadav outside. This is a kid who's had 14-hour surgery. His chest is still open. He's intubated. He's sedated, but he's still aware of what's happening. And suddenly the doctor in charge is saying, we're going to take him outside, which is a really odd thing. But it was one of the most human things anybody's ever done for us. It wasn't out of pity. It wasn't, palliative care, like it's going to be the last breath. So nothing like that. It was he just needed to be outside because he was a kid. And so after this huge amount of effort, which involved a bunch of nurses and another attending physician, they wheeled him outside in his bed to actually smell the fresh air and see the trees and see his brothers playing. And that idea of being outside was really remarkable to me, at least. Um, that's what you would decide to do at that moment in time. And they did it over and over again. In fact, one of the doctors, without permission, I might add, took him out at night. And we heard later that he did not have permission to, but we were grateful there because he got to look up and see the stars. And so when we emerged in Philadelphia, which was, I think, a much more cognizant of liabilities and rules and regulations, we pushed to make sure that he had similar experience. We started by exploring every inch of the hospital. Um, we went and there was a building under construction nearby, and a new wing of the hospital that was under construction. And because I had made friends with the security guards, which is a very good thing to do when you're in a hospital environment, most important people you can make friends with are the security guards. They let us roam everywhere, and they let us go into this under construction. I mean, it wasn't like a work site with hard hats, but it was pretty empty. And we just sort of like walk around and look at the views from the upper floors. And then we started like pushing to have therapies outside, like music therapy. We asked if it was just the beginning of the summer by then or the spring, like, can we have music therapy outside? And they're like, I guess we could. Why not? And then we started pushing them out to the front of the hospital. And then we might have gone off hospital grounds. And I might have snuck him into the car just to see what it was like because he hadn't been in our car in over a year, almost a year. And I might have driven that car out of the parking lot just so we could see, a bit of Philadelphia. And the greatest compliment I got when we were in Pennsylvania was a doctor who got exasperated and said, "You're never here." And I was like, "No, we're not. We're not in the room," because I just didn't want him to spend his, 6 months lying in the room staring at the ceiling or, God forbid, staring at TV and vegging out. I mean, you have to do that. There's a role for that, obviously. But we didn't want to lose the spirit of like kidness. That was really important.
for you? I mean, I love that story and how it evolves, how it unfolds in the book, and the theme comes up from Australia to Philadelphia. For you as a parent in that situation, and again, I haven't had it, for you and Tali, is it you just leave your expectations of real life at the door? Like, do you just surrender to being inside the ha- does it just happen because you have no choice? Is there a conscious shedding of normal life in order to make being inside the hospital, either the room itself or the floor, like, how do you do that?
How do you live in a hospital?
Yeah.
You have to kind of understand how it works, I think. I think you have to understand kind of its rhythms. I think you have to understand the people there and what they care about and make sure that you are respectful of what they care about. You're a guest in their home, sort of. You're a guest, but it doesn't mean you have to be deferential. You just have to sort of be able to respect what's important to them and work within it.
Mhm.
So I always found that being, respectful and courteous to the people who cared for us, whether they were doctors or security guards, was really important. Now, at the same time, we sort of not demanded in an obnoxious way, but we expected the same for us,
Mhm.
right? We expected them to treat us like humans, right?
Yeah.
Not like customers or anything like that. We were guests in their house, right? So there's a certain way you treat guests. The one time I got angry a few times, and probably I didn't put all of them in the book because I didn't want to embarrass myself, but I think I do mention the one time I got really angry um, at CHOP, which was really an odd thing. It was Parking was a big theme of our experience. I actually had a whole chapter on parking, which one of my editors had me take out. So I
Well,
sort of had to.
parking is hell for most parents if
Yeah,
you
I can talk about
park.
parking
Yeah.
for an hour. That's a different pod. That's a different like session. But parking was very important because you got to find somewhere to put the car. And luckily in Philadelphia, they had a parking lot, and we had this old Subaru with like a bubble on the top where we put all our camping gear. And I didn't want to take it off, so and it was slightly higher. It was slightly higher than the limit, but I knew it fit because we'd done it over and over again. We'd been there for 6 months, and one security guard gave me a hard time. He said, "You can't park here." And I said, "Look, I've parked here every day for the past 4 months." And he said, "Nope, rules is rules. You can't do it." And that's the only time I got really angry. I might have lost my temper, because he didn't treat me as like humanity. It was like rules and regulations. And I didn't think that was how we should be treated or deserve to be treated. And I think that kind of works both ways as well.
Yeah. Well, that's a good segue to uh how you what did you appreciate most about what how you and Tolly and Nadav's medical team, both in Australia and at CHOP, sort of themes that ran through how you and the team worked with for Nadav's care.
I wouldn't exclude Mount Sinai from that conversation
Okay.
because
Okay.
they were our hospital for his first three surgeries, which was probably the most critical time of his life, including the NICU.
Okay.
Um, what characterized our relationship? Um,
But you and I, when we talked about how you built sort of what you identified as those key ingredients for building a constructive working relationship, a functional working relationship.
yeah, I mean, I think the first step was we had to be educated about what was going on, and that doesn't mean like Googling everything. Although my wife Tali is a remarkable woman for many reasons, not least of which that she likes reading medical journals. And actually, it's one of the main reasons that we were able to come back from Australia is because she found an article in a medical journal that nobody else had noticed. And you'll have to read the book, I guess, to get that whole story. But we educated ourselves. And for me, it was less about reading medical journals or watching videos of surgeries, which she also does, because I could not stand to watch that. For me, it was like about listening and making sure that we listened to people and their expertise. Now, not all doctors were willing to do that. A lot of doctors, well, some doctors we met view themselves as the experts, and you're the parents, and your job is to be deferential and let the doctors do their job. And I never really enjoyed that way of thinking, and neither did Tali, I don't think. It's interesting when we were in Australia, we would characteristically, we were in a intensive care unit, like a regular intensive care unit, not a cardiology intensive care unit. And there would be new doctors who rotated in every 3 days, and we would bombard them with questions inevitably. And a lot of them said the same thing, which was, um, we have to get to know him. You got to be patient. We have to get to know him. And I thought that was absolutely fascinating. It was not meant to like brush us off. I could tell, like it wasn't like just leave me alone. It was more like just be patient. And the reason they wanted us to be patient is they realized that their job was not to heal Nadav. only Nadav can heal himself, right? I mean, the healing is an intrinsically human thing. It's something the body does. They played an important role, but their role was to give him the best opportunity to heal himself through the therapies and the medications and the procedures that they did, so that his body could heal just the same way a paper cut heals. And I thought that was a really fascinating, profound thing to say because it was very human. And it was also very humble. And I think the most of the doctors we met were very humble. They realized that their job was not just to heal, but it was also to listen. It was to teach. You know, we had doctors who sat us down and gave us like graduate level seminars and various aspects of his condition, which I always thought was pretty cool. Um, Educate and then partner and then work together. Because in many ways, this might sound weird, like I think we were the medical experts. Now, how can you say that when you have a team of doctors who have been training their whole lives? Well, we knew how Nadav's body worked. We saw him all the time. We knew how he reacted to things. We knew how the signals the body was telling us. If you want to get to know Nadav, even as a patient, like we are your best resource to do that. Um, the thing that I think of all the time is we would get him, we take him for checkups at Mount Sinai, and they would always start by doing a check of the SAT. So they would put, pulse ox around the finger or the toe, and they do the readings. And of course, the readings would always be low because it wasn't on properly, and it would read 60. And the technician was kind of freaking out. We're like, no, 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 it's not 60. Just adjust it, blah, 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 blah. And we always got it to where it meant to be because we knew how to put it on and we knew. And so the best doctors treated us as medical partners,
Mm-hmm.
not just partners, medical partners.
Mm-hmm.
The other time I got really upset in Philadelphia actually was not just the parking. The other time I got really upset was when they rounded without us. There was one time they rounded without us and I hit the roof because that was so insulting. And it was also doing Nadav a disservice to leave us out of the equation. And in fact, not only did we participate in rounds, but Nadav participated in rounds. They would wheel him out of the room because he was an exceptionally wise soul. And they knew that he wanted to be part of the conversation and he'd sit there and listen. And they would actually, his problems in Philadelphia were mainly around his lungs were not clearing properly. And they would flip the x-ray around so that he would be able to sit there and see the cloudy spot on the x-ray that frustrated all of us. And they'd point it out, not in a condescending way. And so involving the whole family was a very literal, I know it's a buzzword in hospitals, but for us, it was a very literal thing and a very comforting thing. And I think it was not just that, it was actually essential for the miracles that we saw in the ways that he healed and was resilient was in part because of that holistic care that he received.
Mm, I love that. There was the respecting not just you and Tali, but Nadav to hear and see what was happening to him because it was actually happening to him, but giving him a different perspective on what was happening to him.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know because I'm not a psychologist how much he knew about his condition, but I suspect he knew more than any of us about his condition because it was him. It was his
Did he,
body.
did he ever ask you and Tali about what was happening to him and what was likely to happen to him?
Um, you mean ultimately what was likely to happen to him?
Yeah, did you have conversations about, I mean, I know he was very young, but
Well, we never, I don't want to cut you off. We never felt that it was likely that he would die because I think that for us, that would be kind of given up. We always knew it was a possibility, but
mm,
we didn't want to have it like, I think it's a terrible thing to admit that it's something is going to happen. Even when we were told that he would not make it, we never gave up hope. In fact, we flew him home, so anything's possible. That's the first thing.
yeah.
Did we talk to him about it? I honestly don't remember the detail that we talked about it. I don't think I ever had to wrestle with telling him that he might die. And in fact, that was one of the things that I would have feared as he grew older.
Mhm.
And he became, he had when he had hopes and dreams, and like how do you talk to an 18-year-old about that? I think it's different than talking to a 5-year-old about it.
Yeah.
But thankfully, I mean, not thankfully. I mean, I wish I'd been able to talk to him about it, but I don't know what I would have done. I suspect that I would have had to rise to the occasion just like anything else. But
What
there's
did,
no shortage of terrible things that you imagine that you'd have to do that you find the strength to do when
yeah.
you're presented with them.
Yeah. You, and at least according to your book, you do rise to them, James. You do.
Well, you got to do it. And people are like we're not special people. I don't think we're special. We're just parents. I'll tell you the most terrifying thing I had to do while he was alive was to put an NG tube in his
Yeah,
nose.
you talk about that.
Okay.
You became a pro.
I am a pro at there's my secret talent is I can put an NG tube in a sleeping baby in the middle of the night, pitch dark without them waking up. And that skill, unfortunately, is completely useless. And that is one of the things that you grieve when you lose a complicated kid, is it rips a certain part of your identity out as a parent that has become a part of who you are. Like you find your identity is wrapped up in all these things that you do for this child, and suddenly those skills are completely useless. And it's funny, Gilad, our older son, had to have a checkup. Um, and I had to get something done in the hospital. I can't even remember. It was like a silly thing, but I knew how to do it. This is long after Nadav had died. Like I knew how to do it. I was like, "Oh, I know how to get this done." It was just a checkup, but it was like it was heartwarming that suddenly I was back there. It sounds like a
Yeah.
terrible thing to say. That was I don't want
No.
to be back in the hospital, right? But that I was back there and I had that skill that I could use to help my family. Like that as a father is like a really great feeling.
Um, the Rob Delaney wrote the memoir Heart That Hurts, and he talks about the how he became a master of managing his son's trach, and he was so proud of how he managed that trach, just the way we were so proud of the NG tube. And he says he writes exactly the same way about this extraordinary skill that he no longer gets to use,
Mm,
and how that's a, a loss that only parents like you could actually relate to.
yeah.
Um,
Rob uses much more colorful language in his book than
yes,
I
he
do in
does.
mine, but it's still
He
entertaining, I hope.
does.
Yeah.
He does. Um, one of the things that you really appreciated about the physicians you and Tally talked to was the extent to which they um, you used the word humble earlier, but their ability to communicate the ambiguities of medicine to you and their willingness to acknowledge them, talk about them, situate themselves inside the ambiguity. Can you talk a little more about that, please?
This something that always struck me throughout his life was how ambiguous a lot of things are. Very little is set in stone. Even he was a splenic. He was born without a spleen, which basically means that you're a higher risk for infection. So he needed prophylactic amoxicillin every day, and even the pharmacist disagreed about whether it should be refrigerated or not. I mean, that's a stupid small thing, right? But it's still like there's the ambiguity right there. But even big things, we don't know how these procedures are going to turn out. We don't even know what the odds are a lot of the time. We can guess at it. Um, his last procedure was lymphatic embolization, which actually helped us go home. Lymphatics are fascinating in the field of pediatric cardiology and only just now being understood thanks to doctors like the doctors we had at CHOP who are doing pioneering work here. But even they didn't know like what was causing these frustrating leaks into his lung. And in fact, in the final procedure, the two doctors doing the procedure disagreed about where they should do the embolization. Should they do it in the thoracic duct or they should do it in the liver? And I think eventually they're just like, let's do both. And so we'll never know who's right because they did both and it healed the leak after 6 months, which was crazy. That is not guesswork. It's educated guesswork, but it's based on a lot of experience and expertise. I'm not denigrating that at all. But there are a lot of things you don't know, and I think the best doctors accept that. And I think the if you look at the history of heart surgery, which I find fascinating, so much of it is filled with doctors who are willing to take risks based on very educated guesses in the hopes that something might work and live with the consequences. And that's why we make progress and that's why we learn things. The Dr. Jack Rome at CHOP, who did this procedure that allowed us to revert to Fontan circulation without surgery, that was a procedure that had done it on fewer than a dozen children when it happened to Nadav. And that was because he just had a hunch that it would work and he tried it. You don't know how it's going to turn out the first time you do something. And often it doesn't turn out the way you want it to, but you have to live with that as well. Because that ambiguity is part of what makes us human. And as parents, we have to wrestle with the same ambiguities, if not more so.
Well, so that's actually something. Um, I loved when you were talking about that, and I have in my time. I think when my daughter Cameron was alive, and the biggest challenge that we had to wrestle with medically was not the trajectory of her life, which was pretty straightforward what was going to happen, but with management of her seizures. And I was really uh, taken aback by how some of the best one of the best pediatric neurologists in North America could not figure out how to get her seizures under control without having her be pretty sedated from medicine. And I was really surprised by that. Was my first like, oh wow, like I would like there's the art here, and and you don't always know how to make it work. And now, since in the past 15 years, I've come to really understand the art, appreciate the art piece of that, and those clinicians who aren't afraid to talk about the art and the mystery. Well, they don't name it as art, but the mystery of the human body and the mystery of medicine, and how they, like parents, can be humbled by what's happening.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure doctors struggle with it. We saw doctors struggle with the ambiguities that we couldn't figure out why things were happening the way they were. Um, and we couldn't figure it out either, and that can lead to frustration. But I think we were frustrated together, if that makes
Yeah,
sense.
yeah,
Like we were able to
yeah,
be frustrated again. We found a way to be frustrated together and realize that we were a team and work together in everywhere that we were.
yeah,
Um, and that was super important because I think I think it's very easy to get frustrated and turn that frustration outward into anger or bitterness, which I think I also read about.
yeah.
And I've read some very bitter and angry books written by parents who have lost children who have had entirely different relationship with their medical team, where that ambiguity expresses itself as frustration. But I think that, listen, we're human. There's a lot of things we don't know, and we have to accept that. And I think that's a large theme in this book is
Yeah.
not just the terror in the things we don't know and the things that can go wrong, but there's so many magical things that go right in the human body that when you stop to consider it are really kind of crazy, and we'll never understand that either.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the blessing of humanity is there are things that are beyond your understanding that you can be in awe of as well as being terrified of the horrible things too.
Well, you write about that, about how Nadav's body was constantly awe. You were in constant awe of what was happening because he did keep coming, surviving and healing and getting to the next place in ways that you had never, that the doctors didn't think was possible.
It's not just like recovering from 14 hours of surgery, like 7.5 hours on bypass. That is incredible. But the things his body would do to try to compensate for what was wrong with his circulation,
Yeah.
there are these tiny little veins which grow called collaterals. And it represents like the body's best guess about how to fix an unbalanced circulation. Now, often that guess in the long term is wrong because the body is not terribly sophisticated about it. It just does it, but it is the body seeking some way to heal, the same way your finger seeks to heal when you cut it. And to see that like firsthand, as maddening as it was to watch his circulation turn into a Jackson Pollock painting, there was a sort of like magic in it. It's like, well, how the heck does his body know how to grow these things?
Yeah.
And even though in the long term it probably wasn't great because it probably prevented us from getting a heart transplant, in the short term it was remarkable because it helped him walk out of the hospital. So yeah,
I love that part. And I learned, I I don't know that any of us would know that that sort of thing is possible until you read it.
I
Um,
don't know. I can't think of. I mean, that wonder is incredible. Like, there's so much wonder in
mhm,
it. And doctors, I didn't learn about how his body formed from a doctor. I found about it from the New York Times. How as an embryo, his
mhm,
his body formed the wrong way, which
mhm.
is like an entirely magical thing.
Yeah,
Um,
you guys got to read the book
yeah, I'll leave that.
to understand that.
Yeah,
Um, on this, can you read James and what we were just talking about? Um, on what in my copy is page 219, starting with, "We'd come to learn how doctors draw on their experience."
yeah, sure. The Blythe is a VIP, so she got a specially numbered copy
It's
of the
a it's
book.
a different version, different page number in
I
the
think that's the
other
Portuguese
copy.
translation, isn't it?
Yeah,
Okay, no. Okay, so in my book it's 238. We'd come to learn, right?
yeah,
Um, We'd come to learn how doctors draw on their experience and knowledge while making decisions, keeping in mind that the choices they make are not infallible. Information isn't perfect, and nobody can predict the future. The best we can do is imagine outcomes, weigh them against each other, and then decide, hoping for the best. We made countless decisions, large and small, in Nadav's life. In every decision, there was uncertainty, a quiet worry that the choice may not have been the right one. For big decisions, that sliver of fear chills your bones if you stare at it long enough. I always found solace by resolving not to look back, that nothing good could come of it. The decisions of the past were unchangeable and ultimately irrelevant. With each choice, life's alternate paths were erased, as unknowable as the future. To wonder what might have been, I felt, could only result in bitterness and grief, a sadness as corrosive as a pillar of salt.
I was reading that when I read that, and I was underlining it. Um, I was like, yes, 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 because at Courageous Parents Network, we really, I mean, that's one of the reasons I started it, was like, what can be done to minimize decisional regret, because it is regret that is corrosive and complicates everything ever after. So reading you having landed there yourself with eloquent language, and looping in his clinical care team, I was just so, I was relieved for you, James. I was, and I was, and it that level of acceptance and generosity and is infused throughout this book. And I think it is because of your curiosity and your spiritual orientation and your fascination with mystery, the mystery of the human body, and your respect for medicine, and your kinship with fellow human beings who are just showing up trying to do their best. Not only does it help you over the course of your son's life and in the years that followed as you were writing this book, it makes this book, it makes Nadav's story not just bearable to read, but actually beautiful to read. It is very much the way I felt reading your book.
Thank you, Blythe.
Yeah,
I mean, the one
really.
thing I would add is I think we were very lucky to have amazing doctors and medical professionals caring for us. This is not to say that people do not make mistakes. And I think I only mentioned it once. It's a testament to the quality of the care that we had that I can only remember like individual occurrences where people made things that were obviously the wrong decisions. Um, there was a nurse who put the NG tube down the wrong way, and that really stood out for being something that was obviously like wrong. So I don't want to say that bad things never happen, but certainly in our experience, we were lucky to have doctors who were humble enough that we could feel that we were working with them in good faith to do the best we could for our son.
We've talked about the doctors, but you have a very, like most parents who live in the ICU, soft spot for nurses.
Yeah, yeah,
Let's talk about the nurses.
yeah. They bring the humanity into the equation. Really, they're the representatives of the humanity. I think they're incredible. A real thankless job too. I think, um, but a really important one because they're caring for the whole human. That is their job. Right?
Mhm.
They blend the humanity with the medical stuff in a way that I found really inspiring. Um, the nurses that we had, and actually we were on some units that were not well staffed with nurses, and it was really stood out because of the quality of care we had had. We didn't take it for granted. Um, but but yeah, I think at one point I called them no nonsense magicians or something. Um, uh, the one story that I like to tell about like nursing at its best for us was in Australia when Nadav had a medicine that made him very itchy. And he was sort of sedated as well, so he was a little out of it. But he had this persistent itch. You couldn't like reason with him, that's the point I'm trying to make. And at night, while he was sleeping, he would scratch the itch, right? He'd scratch the itch, which is a normal thing to do when you're itchy. And nurses would either like wrap his hands or they would tie his hand down, not like with duct tape or anything like that, in a gentle way. Um, but but we came in one morning to find a nurse before the night nurse was still there, and she had spent the night holding his hand. And that was just incredible because it was that like sense of touch, that really human sense of touch that is healing and it's caring and it's just the right solution to the problem, right? And it's a really hard thing to do, I'm sure, when you're busy and running around. I'm sure like a day nurse might not have time to do it, but she did. She did it all night. And we saw countless examples of nurses just just caring for him, not because they had to, but because it was the right thing to do.
Mm. Um, can you read, uh, you described something, and then I'm gonna open it up and see if people have questions for you soon. Um, you described something, James, that I think all parents like us flirt or wrestle with, and that is these pockets, these flashes of bitterness
Mm,
or negative feelings towards uh, people, particularly parents of healthy children, who we perceive as being clueless about their good fortune. And so can you read that? For me, it's page 255, beginning these moments of bitterness.
yeah, this is something I actually still wrestle with, and I think it's probably even harder after death to wrestle with it. But this is in the context of when he was alive. Um, those moments of bitterness only emerged every so often, in all their terrible honesty, a single glance unleashing demons within. Take one moment that struck unexpectedly on a beautiful summer day, Tali in Philadelphia, and me back home in New York with the boys. As I crossed the street, I saw a new mother in front of me, pushing an expensive pram. Walking by her side was a nanny, diaper bag slung over her shoulder. That otherwise ordinary scene has stayed in my mind for a single reason. Instead of the happiness one usually feels for a new parent, I felt nothing but anger. Why, my inside screamed, must this mother need help with something so simple as a single healthy baby? I'd felt that separation before in different contexts. I thought back to the day our older son was born, when I'd passed packed bars full of laughter. What on earth were they all celebrating, I'd wonder. I felt no bitterness then, of course, just a strange sense that my happiness stood alone. But bitterness starts with that sense of lonely difference, that you alone suffer from something from which others are exempt, that they never really know how you feel. What turns that feeling into anger is the misguided conviction that they don't care, and you really want to feel that way sometimes because they don't need to care, and you do. But they do care, really, or they would if they only knew.
Yeah. That's a great example of how you touch something that's very real and dark, and then you metabolize it and come out into a place that's light and hopeful. Not Pollyannish, but light and hopeful. They do care really, or they would if they only knew. And I think this book, James, honestly, if somebody were to read this who has no experience, and I hope parents, I hope adults um, choose to pick up this book to just read about this is the exquisite example of courage and present parental resiliency and the resiliency of children and the commitment of clinicians and parents and the shared enterprise. It's all right here in this book. Um, and I just that going from the dark and the difficult into the light is what more than we expected does, and it is why I strongly recommend it for anyone, but particularly parents, and obviously for any clinician who's just wanting to see what's possible as parents process. Parents who have a capacity to write. Uh, how when did you decide? When did you know you wanted to write this book, or rather, what was your reasoning? Like what? How did this come to be?
Okay, so I work at the New York Times, as you know. I'm behind the scenes. I don't write usually for the Times. But after Nadav died, the company was very supportive. After he died, we decided to take this crazy road trip and just get the heck out of town and breathe on the open road. And when my colleagues found out about this, they said, well, you need to write about this. So I was like, sure, okay. So when we got back from this crazy road trip, I wrote about the road trip and it was published in the travel section of the Times back when we had a travel section. And it resonated with people because I got all these notes from people who had dealt with a loss, dealt with it by going on a road trip, dealt with it by camping. Like there was people there who I may had a connection with because of our story had helped them or resonated with something in them. And soon after that, I was like, I got to get all this stuff out of my brain. Otherwise, it's going to be lost. All the memories we had in Nadav of what we had been through, I had to get it on paper just so it wouldn't haunt me most of all. And so I started writing essays every night. I would write an essay about faith or anatomy or parking. I wrote a whole essay about parking. Um, and eventually that sort of like, long story short, turned into a book. It's a very long and hard process. It took 6 years to actually make this, from that first essay to publishing it, to make it real, and a lot of revisions. But I'm glad I did. I dedicate the book to Nadav's brothers, because it's really for them when they're old enough to really like wrestle with this stuff and understand what we had been through. It'll always be there for them, so that my perspective at least they'll have that. But it's also written for parents in similar situations, hoping that it'll give them strength. It's written for medical professionals, not just doctors, but nurses, therapists, child life people, security guards, anybody involved in the care of kids. I think it's important they learn what we had learned, because some of it's very important, I think. And I think it's written for anybody who wrestles with these themes, like the things beyond your understanding, and how do you cope with that? It's funny, people ask me how many kids we have, and I have to answer them honestly. I say 3, and they say, how old are they? And I say 16 and 12. And I could use the twins as a dodge, because their eyebrows are raised when they hear that, but I often don't. Even if it's a perfect stranger, I'll tell them what happened, because those conversations are really meaningful, because everybody is wrestling with some sort of trauma. And I found that when I bring it up on my end, it gives them permission to, if not openly share it, but at least live with it for a few minutes. And that's quite important and meaningful. And those are actually the most meaningful conversations I've had since he died. People who have shared similar stories or even dissimilar stories. And so that's part of why I wanted to publish the book, is to help parents and doctors, but also connect with people who are wrestling with similar things.
And that's why I want lots of people to read this book.
Thank you.
All right, I'm going to remove the spotlight on you and look at the other people here. Who I would like to invite anyone to raise their hand, unmic theirself, ask a question. Please don't be shy. Any questions for Jane? Oh, Renee?
I'll just say it resonates a lot, James. My daughter also had heterotaxy. And she also spent the first 4 years of her life, she was probably inpatient 6 to 9 months at a time. She died at age 8. And you talk about creating a life in the hospital, like, for people who have short-term hospitalizations, you figure out how to stop life so that, everything sort of stops so that you can, focus on inside life. But when you live there long enough, that becomes your life. Like, you have to figure out, how do you take care of your other kids? How do you create a quality of life for your kid? How do you get creative about that? I remember one doctor saying to us, well, we're not used to having kids who aren't attached to a machine or a wall, because she was primarily ICU level care, even when she wasn't necessarily ventilated, like she could pop around. So like you said, getting creative about, how do we take you outside? Like, we used to do a thing where, when you talk about the rhythms of the hospital, like, she was so social. Like, we would sit there at like 6:30 when nurses would start coming in for shift change, so that she could wave to everybody and like comment on, what I mean? Like, oh, like, I like your earrings or whatnot. And people could come in and be like, oh, hi, Serafina. You know what I mean? It would be the whole parade of nurses in and out, just to give her a little bit of that social outlet. So we could sort of time it when she was feeling well to do those kind of things. But, how you talk about the ability to really bloom where you're planted is kind of how we talked about it. Like you said, nobody wants to do it that way, but you're not really given an alternative. And I think it's a real testament to the resiliency of our children. Serafina was never bitter about being in the hospital. it was just where she was, right? That was her playroom. Those were her play pals. Like, and I think it's a testament to our kids, the way that they're actually, I think the ability to not be bitter really came from our child's capacity to find joy wherever they were. So I was just going to say that, really resonated a lot with me about how our kids really were our best teachers on how to be okay with the circumstances we were facing.
Yeah, that
you,
was
Renee.
that's thank you I'm so sorry for your loss. I mean, I'm sure we could talk for hours about all this. Because you just triggered all these memories of what we did when we were in the hospital. And that means a lot. And I think being his parent was such a profound privilege. Like I wouldn't change any of it except for the end, obviously, but it it revealed so much to me that I learned from him and his brothers and the other kids who he met. And you'll see it in the book, right? Like there's so much that we learn, and that's why I had to write it. And it was such a gift. And I think it's hard for other people to understand that as well. Like I write on the second page, like it's not a sad story.
It's not a sad story.
It's not a sad story. And
Not a sad
one of
story.
my friends actually wrote to me today, and he said, "I didn't believe you. Like when I saw that on the page, I didn't believe you, and now I believe you." And that was like the most gratifying thing somebody could say to me in response to the book. Like
Yeah.
that meant a lot.
Yeah. Does anybody else have a question or a comment for James? Sue, and then I don't know if yeah, we'll do Sue and then Betsy. Oh, Sue, you're mic'd. I mean, you're muted. There you go.
Okay. I just want to thank you, James, for sharing your story. It's it means a lot. I have a grandson who has a life-limiting diagnosis, who's 4 and doing very, very well. But yeah, the uncertainty is always there. So your story about giving your son the best life and sharing everything to the best that he could have while you could is something that we continually practice and hope, because we just don't know what lies ahead. But it is difficult, and hearing stories like yours is a huge help.
Thank you, Sue. That means a lot. I mean, it was difficult. I don't want to make it sound like it was not difficult. It was difficult in part because his brothers, in some ways, didn't have the life that they deserved, because a lot of the time it centered around Nadav. And we did our best to balance it out with them too. But there were moments there where they were really at the mercy of their parent, like exhausted, distracted parents having to deal with really difficult things, and making sure that they didn't feel neglected at the same time was a huge obligation. Something that I certainly wasn't able to do to how I wanted to do it. But yeah, it was a really difficult road. But I have to say, like your comment, and Renee, like one of the unexpected joys of writing this book is connecting with strangers who have been through similar things in a way that, again, when you lose a child, that sort of world is closed off to you a little bit, and reconnecting with people has been a real privilege of actually publishing this thing. So thank you for that, Sue.
Betsy, did you want to ask or say something?
Sure. Thank you, James. What a great hour to sort of listen to you, hear about your process. I have had the honor over the last 30 years to take care of and learn how to doctor from parents like you and Tali, whose children are born with congenital heart disease. And I've spent most of my career trying to understand parent perspective, and your book has been an incredible addition to helping us figure out how to train this, and how to teach doctoring in the face of uncertainty. And so I thank you for that. My curious question is what was your process on picking the title of your book? And how did you land there?
Publishing a book is a real difficult path, like really hard at every stage. The title it was really hard too. I won't go into the gory details. I will let you know that there was a moment where I was on the phone with my agent, and she's just like, "You have to let it go. It's a good title." and you should be happy with it. And she was right. It's a really good title. I thought so for a minute, and then I changed my mind, and now I've changed my mind again. And the reason I like it is it sort of plays on, the idea that you're expecting. That's a parental thing, right? You're expecting it, and you expect great things of your children. And it's very easy when a child like this is born to be, I guess, like maybe people feel it's like disappointed, or like that's not the life I wanted. It's not the life I expected, and it's not the life we expected at all. Like when you find out you're pregnant, it's just like an unbridled joy, and suddenly you're handed this like giant challenge. But it turned out to be a lot more than sort of what we expected it to be. So that's the reason I like the title. I don't know how we came up with it. We just stumbled around in the dark. I have like a list of like 800 titles, but it came to be the right one. So I got lucky, I guess.
His name, James. His name.
Oh yeah, sorry.
I was gonna say, Polly, thank you, because I was going to say I feel like I remember it.
It
had
doesn't
also something
literally,
to do with his
yeah.
name.
So Nadav's name means generous, in Hebrew, which can be interpreted as giving more than is expected, which is part of the reason we gave him that name. So it is a play on his name as well.
How did you found out that he had the heart defect? How prenatally, right?
Yes, I would say during a routine anatomy scan, Tali will tell you exactly how many days it was into the pregnancy. But yes, they missed it on the first scan because he had a twin who was obstructing the view, and then they found on the next scan, and they just said something's wrong with the heart. And then the next day we found ourselves in Mount Sinai Hospital getting a 3-hour echo, which was terrifying too. And we met the doctor who came from Dr. Shubika Srivastava, who's now at Nemours, who I think from that very first day exemplified everything that we were looking for in a doctor. And she's incredible. And she's a character in this book. And graciously, she allowed me to use her name because I think it's a testament to her. She taught us a lot. And we went through a lot together. And she opened her eyes to the emotions sometimes doctors feel too, when they're dealing with the consequences of their decisions as well, and how they approach it with grace and caring, which is not always easy. I have a lot of empathy for that.
I want to acknowledge that Tali, Nadav's mom, is here. Just Tali, you have to wave. So, yay, Tali. All right. So I've loved this conversation, James. I'm going to stop recording.